Hi, and welcome to the Philosopher's Clearinghouse. Premium thought at a wholesale price. Let's think big things together. I'm your host, Calvinist Klein, a.k.a. Romans 918. a.k.a. a scandalous sinner. Today's essay is a paraphrase called Kant and the Kantians. It examines what has come to be known as the cognitive crisis of the Enlightenment. Namely, one must reject dogmatic starting points about the nature of reality, but if one rejects such dogmatic starting points, how can one make a convincing argument about reality with certainty and overcome doubt and skepticism? In 1781, Immanuel Kant published The Critique of Pure Reason, a volume now recognized as one of the most important works in philosophy. In it, Kant noted there were important questions about reality that could not be answered by an a priori appeal to reason alone. Questions like the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, the nature of the human mind, and others were beyond the reach of our rational thinking faculty alone. We could not know, as Kant put it, things as they are. This was a shock to the philosophers of the time who just assumed that the nature of reality was obvious and certain and available to the inquiring human subject. Kant's criticism fueled further skepticism, a debate about reality and the future of reasoning itself. Empiricism seemed to lead to an all-consuming skepticism, where human knowledge was imprisoned in relativism and subjective mental states. Objectivity and the truths of traditional religion and morality were brought into doubt, as philosophy seemed to be little more than the skepticism of Hume and the idealism of Berkeley. And the concepts of narrative and authoritative normative principles unraveled in the minds of many of Kant's contemporaries. However, many remained unaffected by Kant and still held to the traditional objectivism, such as those from the Scottish school of common sense philosophy and others. Kant strongly rejected dogmatic assertions about reality and used a synthesizing method to respond to what came to be known as the cognitive crisis of the Enlightenment. Instead of a formal approach, Kant developed a way of talking about the a priori and a posteriori forms of knowledge. He introduced a foundation for a priori knowledge, namely the synthetic judgment, and postulated a barrier between the real nature of things and a human understanding of them. One could understand reality only as a dialectical engagement with the raw inputs of experience and reason. This engagement had to appeal to something beyond the raw inputs themselves to supply the meaning. This transcendental philosophy was more than just a negative reaction brought about by skepticism and doubt. It was a positive philosophical force and was a step above mere criticism. He thought this new method gave metaphysics a solid foundation, though in doing so, he abandoned traditional categories of knowledge. While he proposed a clear method, he did not always acknowledge the controversy of some of the concepts in his new philosophy. He proposed that knowing is transcendental in that it is occupied not with the objects of reality themselves, but with the knowing mind's understanding of them. Kant used new patterns developed in mathematics and other sciences in his day to criticize the assumption of a mind's eye, or a light of reason, which presumed that in thinking about a thing, one was grasping the essential nature of said thing. Kant thought that reason can only have insight into its own internal storehouse of concepts, and that there was no reason to suppose that our internal concepts shared a unity with the reality they were trying to model. This was controversial, and much philosophical activity came about afterwards because of it. Some thought philosophy had been reduced to a subversive doubt and skepticism that eliminated any real knowledge about reality, while others thought that traditional metaphysics could meet the challenge of these empirical, skeptical attacks. In the aftermath, the defenders of the traditional categories of faith, common sense, and metaphysics remained, but almost everyone else spoke with the new Kantian spirit. But a new unified philosophical vocabulary did not lead to unified results in philosophy, and many use Kant's terms and concepts only to, after a time, eventually discard them. These anti-Kantian Kantians turned into what later came to be known as the continental philosophical tradition, and was famously summarized by Hegel. Philosophy is a child of its time in thought form, meaning that to understand a concept was to transcend it in applying meaning and incorporate it into a rational development process. Reality stimulated the philosopher to study, and the stimulation led philosopher to study the science of being stimulated. Kant's revolution was to note that reason was not studying the substantial structure of reality, but was studying its study. Our object is not the nature of things, but the human understanding of the nature of things. This thinking about thinking set the constraints of what would later develop into logical positivism and the linguistic turn. This link between Kant and Hegel is important, but to understand it, one must investigate the great explosion of system building, theology, and aesthetics that Kant's spark started. This is Romans 9:18 for the Philosopher's Clearinghouse.